The modern mental health industry has spent decades gaslighting you into believing that your chronic anxiety is a medical defect. We are conditioned by prescription cultures and wellness apps to view our internal dread as a chemical glitch that needs to be numbed, managed, or optimized out of existence. But Søren Kierkegaard looked into the baseline architecture of human consciousness and discovered a brutal, liberating psychological truth. Your anxiety is not a sickness. It is the absolute proof of your freedom. Kierkegaard was the true grandfather of existential psychology, a brilliant, isolated Danish thinker who realized that the crushing weight you feel when staring into the future is actually the dizziness of freedom. We are completely terrified of our own boundless potential, paralyzed by the realization that we alone must write the script of our existence with zero guarantees from the universe. To avoid this terrifying responsibility, our egos construct elaborate defense networks. We hide inside collective groupthink, we numb ourselves with aesthetic pleasures, and we play predefined societal roles to escape our own identity. This isn't a comforting self-help lecture designed to boost your self-esteem. It is a clinical, psychological interrogation of your self-deception. Over the next 4 chapters, we are going to strip away your comforting cultural conditioning, analyze the structural pathology of despair, and confront the raw, dark reality of choice. By the time the screen fades to black, you will realize that your worst fears are not a prison, they are the absolute, necessary gateway to your genuine soul. You can no longer blame your parents, your environment, or your circumstances. You are standing on the edge of the cliff, and the only way out is through the leap. We live in a culture that treats human anxiety like a biological manufacturing defect. From the moment we step into the modern world, we are surrounded by an industrialized network of psychological safety valves, wellness apps, and chemical solutions designed to perform a single operation: shut down your internal alarm system. If you wake up in the middle of the night with a heavy, unexplainable weight pressing against your chest, or if you look out at the horizon of your future and feel a deep wave of suffocating dread, our pop psychology immediately steps in to offer a diagnosis. It tells you that your internal panic is a mechanical glitch in your neurochemistry, a temporary deficit of serotonin, or a localized cognitive distortion to be managed, optimized, and deleted from your operating system. We have built a multi-billion-dollar self-help industrial complex around the naive idea that a healthy, integrated human life should be completely smooth, completely predictable, and completely free of internal friction. We treat our chronic psychological discomfort as a foreign virus that has invaded our clean psychological territory. We believe that if we can just buy the right books, execute the perfect morning routine, or find the correct pharmaceutical calibration, we can enter a permanent state of plastic, well-adjusted tranquility. We want to be efficient, we want to be reliable, and we want to look successful in front of the social mirror. But nearly 2 centuries ago, long before the invention of modern clinical psychology or neuroimaging, a brilliant, intensely isolated Danish thinker named Søren Kierkegaard looked into the baseline architecture of human consciousness and discovered a brutal, liberating reality that shatters this entire wellness simulation. He boldly declared that your chronic anxiety is not a medical sickness, it is not a chemical malfunction, and it is not a psychological defect. Your anxiety is the absolute, unyielding proof of your freedom. Kierkegaard introduced this radical, perspective-shifting diagnosis in his psychological masterpiece, The Concept of Anxiety. He argued that what we call existential dread is not a design flaw in the human machine. It is the natural, inevitable, and majestic reaction of a conscious mind confronting the boundless, bottomless abyss of its own infinite possibilities. To be human means you are not an animal trapped inside a rigid, pre-programmed instinct loop. You are a free spirit that has been condemned to write the script of its own existence from scratch, with absolutely zero safety nets or guarantees from the universe. Kierkegaard discovered that the heavy weight you feel when you face a major life choice is actually the dizziness of your own freedom. Your anxiety is the absolute price of your cognitive liberty, and trying to numb that weight is an act of absolute spiritual suicide that strips your soul of its power, leaving you to live like a dead, compliant ghost inside a golden cage of your own making. Fear versus anxiety, slicing the linguistic confusion. To master the deep clinical mechanics of Kierkegaard's architecture of the mind, we must first use a sharp analytical knife to separate two psychological states that modern pop culture constantly confuses: fear and existential anxiety. Angst. Think about a baseline physical threat. You are walking down a dark, empty city street at midnight, and suddenly a massive, aggressive dog breaks its chain, opens its jaws, and sprints straight toward your body. Your nervous system boots up its survival programming instantly. Your adrenaline surges, your heart rate spikes, your breathing narrows, and your focus locks onto the animal with absolute tunnel vision. This state is fear. Fear is a rational, primitive, evolutionary mechanism that possesses a concrete physical object. You fear the dog, you fear the oncoming car, you fear the sudden loss of your bank account, or you fear the medical diagnosis on the paper. Because fear has an object, your brain knows exactly what to do with the data. You fight, you run, or you hide. The target is clear, and once the object is removed from your field of vision, your nervous system returns to its baseline calm. But existential anxiety possesses absolutely no object. It is a state of raw, unanchored dread that does not point to a physical animal, a material threat, or a localized external crisis. You can be sitting in a beautiful, perfectly safe room, surrounded by material wealth, luxury, and validation, with a body that is perfectly healthy, and suddenly a cold, crushing wave of emptiness and absolute dread will materialize out of thin air to paralyze your chest. You look around the room for the monster, you look for the emergency, you look for the cause, but there is absolutely nothing there. The screen of your external reality is completely blank. Kierkegaard explains that when you experience this deep, unanchored anxiety, you are not reacting to an object in the world. Your consciousness is reacting to the realization of yourself. Your mind has momentarily ripped off the defensive makeup of your daily routine and forced you to confront the absolute infinity of your own free will. You are not anxious because the world is dangerous. You are anxious because you realize that you possess the boundless power to choose what your life will mean, and that you alone must carry the terrifying, historical weight of the consequences of those choices. Fear is an attack from the outside. Anxiety is a profound, internal confrontation with the absolute baseline authority of your own consciousness. The metaphor of the cliff, the subconscious realization of free will. To make this mind-bending concept accessible to our everyday psychological experience, Kierkegaard constructs one of the most brilliant and enduring metaphors in the history of existential thought: the man standing on the edge of a massive cliff. Imagine walking up to the absolute summit of a jagged mountain peak. You step up to the very edge of the rock, look down into the bottomless, silent chasm stretching miles below your boots, and a sudden, violent wave of physical dizziness hits your brain. Your stomach drops, your knees shake, and you take a frantic step back into the safety of the path. Our standard, superficial psychological interpretation of this moment is simple. We say the man is dizzy because he is afraid of heights or afraid of falling over the edge. We treat the dizziness as an external survival reaction to a physical danger. But Kierkegaard dives beneath the surface layer of this physical reaction and exposes a much deeper, more terrifying subconscious script. He argues that the man is not dizzy because he is afraid of falling. If a strong wind were to blow him off the rock against his will, he would feel terror, but not this unique, paralyzing dizziness. The man is dizzy because his subconscious mind has just made a catastrophic discovery. He realizes that he possesses the absolute, unchecked physical freedom to throw himself off. He realizes that between his physical body and the open air of that abyss, there is no guardrail, no mechanical law of nature, and no cosmic force that will prevent him from making the choice to step off the ledge. The only thing standing between his continued biological existence and absolute destruction is his own conscious will. The dizziness is not a fear of the cliff. It is the terrifying, dizzying realization of his own boundless power. This is the absolute blueprint of your existential life design. Every time you stand before a major life decision, every time you look at the choice to walk away from a secure but soul-crushing corporate career, to end a comfortable but toxic relationship, to move to a foreign city where you know absolutely no one, or to launch a creative mission that has zero guarantees of success, you are that man standing on the edge of the cliff. The anxiety you feel is not the fear of failure or the fear of the unknown. That is just the polite cover story your intellect invents to hide the raw reality from your ego. Your anxiety is the sudden, paralyzing realization that you are the sole author of the outcome. The guardrails of your childhood conditioning, your parental scripts, and your societal expectations have completely evaporated. You are standing on the ledge naked, and the universe has gone completely silent, refusing to give you a single sign, a single rule, or a single safety net. You alone must choose whether to step back into the comfortable cage of your conformity, or execute the radical, terrifying leap into the infinity of your true potential. The illusion of determinism, flying from the control room. The primary psychological defense mechanism that modern human beings construct to escape this dizziness of freedom is the illusion of determinism. We have built an entire cultural vocabulary designed to help us outsource our responsibility for our choices to variables outside our control. We love to treat our personalities, our habits, and our life outcomes as the mechanical, predictable results of our environment, our history, or our biology. When we experience a major failure, or find ourselves trapped in a lifestyle that suffocates our creative spirit, our internal narrator immediately boots up a protective script. It tells us, I am this way because my parents didn't support me when I was young. I am stuck in this corporate cage because the economy is broken. I act out of toxic patterns because I carry a specific genetic predisposition or past trauma. We talk as if we are passive leaves being blown around by the wind of our circumstances, completely powerless to change the direction of our lives. From an analytical, psychological standpoint, this deterministic narrative is a highly sophisticated, cowardly form of self-soothing. Kierkegaard realized that we don't clench onto our victim scripts because we are sad. We clench onto them because they give us a false, comforting sense of relief. If I can convince my brain that I am completely powerless, if I can believe that my life is entirely dictated by my past trauma, my genes, or my economic system, then my anxiety instantly vanishes. The pressure is off. I no longer have to carry the terrifying responsibility of my freedom. I can just lie down in the dark, play the role of the helpless victim, and blame the external world for my stagnation. Kierkegaard shatters this defensive illusion with absolute, clinical ferocity. He forces you to look in the mirror of your citadel and realize that your past history, your environment, and your biological hardware are just raw, neutral material data points on the board. They are the initial placement of the chess pieces, nothing more. They do not hold the remote control to your next choice. The moment you become a conscious, awake adult, the power to interpret that data, the power to write the next line of the script, and the absolute authority to choose your next move belongs entirely, unconditionally to you. You can no longer hide behind your parents. You can no longer blame your system. You can no longer use your past trauma as a permanent legal license to act like a coward in the present moment. Your freedom is a brutal, absolute reality that you cannot resign, trade, or escape. Even when you choose to do absolutely nothing, when you decide to stay inside your toxic relationship, remain at your soul-crushing job, and follow the blind dogmas of your herd, that passivity is not a mechanical result of determinism. It is a conscious, active choice that you are making every single second. You are choosing the cage because you are too terrified to handle the open air of the cliff. The industrialization of anxiety, the matrix of the distracted herd. Why is our modern society so uniquely terrified of this Kierkegaardian framework? Why have we built an entire economic matrix around numbing this dizziness of freedom? Because an awake, anxious, and deeply individual human being who takes absolute responsibility for their consciousness is completely unmanageable, uncancelable, and entirely useless to the corporate machine. The ultimate life cycle of our hyper-connected consumer culture depends entirely on keeping you in a state of permanent, infantile sleep. The system studies your existential anxiety, diagnoses it as a medical sickness, and immediately offers a giant marketplace of plastic solutions to solve the problem. It tells you that the reason you feel that empty, freezing dread inside your chest is not because you are ignoring your true freedom. It is because you haven't bought the right lifestyle toys, optimized your metrics, or checked into the correct tribal echo chambers. It sets up an endless loop of immediate, industrial distractions. Every time your bluebird tries to sing inside your chest, every time the quiet tower of your mind begins to fill with the terrifying roar of existential silence, the Matrix hands you a digital dopamine hit. It commands you to swipe through short-form content, check your social metrics, purchase a luxury asset on credit, or submerge your awareness in a high-stakes corporate political war. The goal is to keep your brain permanently occupied, permanently hyperreactive, and permanently focused on the external screen of reality, ensuring that you never have a single second of quiet space to look inward and face the cliff. This industrialization of anxiety turns the human race into a massive, frantic, and deeply codependent herd. We wear our busy calendars like armor, we turn our professional productivity into an absolute religion, and we hide inside the collective groupthink of our ideological tribes, completely blind to the fact that we are committing absolute psychological suicide just to escape ourselves. We would rather be stressed, exhausted, and broken inside a system that tells us exactly what to think, what to want, and how to live, than face the radical, naked responsibility of standing completely alone before our own free will. Your modern ambition is exposed as nothing more than a highly sophisticated form of panic. You are running as fast as you can on a treadmill of external validation, simply because you are too terrified to stand still and face the absolute stillness of your own sovereign consciousness. The grand synthesis, the anatomy of the self. To truly break out of this industrial cage and reprogram your soul using Kierkegaard's architecture, we must analyze his profound definition of what a human self actually is. In one of the most famously complex opening passages in philosophical history, written in his masterwork, The Sickness unto Death, Kierkegaard outlines a clinical blueprint for the structure of human identity. He writes, "A human being is a synthesis of the infinite and the finite, of the temporal and the eternal, of freedom and necessity. In short, a synthesis. A synthesis is a relation between two factors. So viewed, a human being is not yet a self. The self is the relation which relates itself to its own self. Let us translate this dense analytical terminology into clear, accessible psychological language. Kierkegaard is proving that you are not a fixed, finished product like a stone or an animal. You are a living, breathing paradox, a bridge suspended between two asymmetrical worlds. On one side of the bridge lives your finite, necessary identity, your physical meat, suit, your chronological age, your genetic code, your geographic location, and the hard material limitations of your daily environment. This is your reality as an object in space and time. You cannot change your height with a thought. You cannot erase your historical childhood, and you cannot ignore the laws of gravity. On the other side of the bridge lives your infinite, free consciousness, your capacity to imagine futures that do not yet exist, to choose your moral values, to assign meaning to your trauma, and to permanently alter the direction of your path through the sheer power of your intent. This is your reality as a divine spark of absolute awareness. True psychological health, true integration, and emotional sovereignty only happens when you have the courage to actively hold both sides of this bridge simultaneously. Most people spend their entire lives living in a state of absolute imbalance. They collapse entirely into the finite side of the bridge, becoming dull, mechanical pragmatists who follow rules, chase metrics, and treat their circumstances as an inescapable prison. Or they escape entirely into the infinite side of the bridge, becoming delusional dreamers who write down manifestations, wander through fictional fantasies, and refuse to engage with the heavy, cold material facts of their reality. Your personal hell is maintained entirely by your inability to relate these two sides of your identity to each other. When you step onto the floor of your true self, you stop treating your limitations as an excuse for cowardice, and you stop treating your freedom as a license for fantasy. You accept the cold, hard data points of your finite reality with absolute, radical calm, and you use the absolute power of your infinite consciousness to forge that raw material into a masterpiece of unyielding integrity, honor, and purpose. You become the absolute master of the relation itself. The transformation of dread into power. The ultimate realization of Kierkegaard's architecture of anxiety is that you must completely stop treating your existential dread as an enemy to be destroyed. Your anxiety is not a monster that has come to break your spirit. It is the absolute, necessary gateway to your genuine resurrection. It is the cosmic teacher sent to wake you up from your cultural sleep. He writes a classic, heavy-hitting baseline rule that every human being surviving a personal hell must anchor inside their nervous system. Whoever has learned to be anxious in the right way has learned the ultimate thing. Anxiety is the path of education that saves the soul from being hollowed out by triviality. Think about what happens when you use chemical or digital shields to permanently delete anxiety from your awareness. You don't become free. You become numb. You blunt your razor-sharp edges. You turn down your internal volume, and you strip your psyche of the very fuel it requires to execute an act of radical transformation. Your anxiety is the psychological smoke that rises from the engine of your free will. If you cut the wire to the smoke alarm, the house still burns down. You just ensure that you will sleep comfortably through the disaster until you are turned to absolute ash. When you learn to be anxious in the right way, you welcome the heavy weight inside your chest as a sign of absolute psychological alignment. When you stand on the edge of the cliff before a major life choice, and your brain starts to experience that violent, dizzying wave of existential panic, instead of reaching for a digital distraction or fleeing back into the arms of your herd, you force your nervous system to sit perfectly still inside the center of the storm. You look straight into the bottomless abyss of your own infinite possibilities, separate the raw data from the ego's drama, and you say to your soul with unyielding majesty, "Ah, yes, there it is. The dizziness of my freedom. It has arrived right on schedule. This panic is the proof that I am alive, that I am free, and that the keys to the control room belong entirely to me." You transition from a fragile, defensive asset who is constantly begging the universe to give them a safe space or an easy script into an absolute sovereign of your own consciousness. You realize that the worst thing that can happen to a human being is not to fail, not to be rejected by the tribe, and not to step into the material unknown. The worst thing that can happen to you is to live a life of absolute self-betrayal, to spend your short flash of decades running on a consumerist hamster wheel of external validation, while standing face to face with a dead, aborted soul inside your own chest. You drop the desperate need to manage the external screen. You accept the radical responsibility of your absolute free will. You take off the heavy mask of your compliance. You step out onto the ledge, and you execute the beautiful, invincible leap into the deep reality of your own destiny. We do not merely run from our freedom, we organize our entire lifestyle around the act of escaping it. When confronted with the raw, dizzying realization that we are the sole architects of our destiny, our defensive ego does not simply freeze in terror. It actively builds highly sophisticated, culturally approved psychological fortresses designed to camouflage our cowardice. We adopt prepackaged identities, throw ourselves into structured social games, and chase specific emotional metrics, fully convinced that we are progressing toward maturity. We tell ourselves that we are finding ourselves, building our careers, or establishing our values, completely blind to the fact that we are actually executing a beautifully orchestrated masquerade to avoid looking into the bottomless abyss of our own emptiness. Søren Kierkegaard mapped out this systemic evasion by developing a profound, diagnostic model of human psychological development known as the 3 stages on life's way: the aesthetic, the ethical, and the religious spheres. These are not dry, academic categories or historical phases of civilization. They are the 3 universal existential territories that the human consciousness navigates in its desperate struggle to manage the weight of its own free will. Kierkegaard discovered that the vast majority of human beings spend their entire lives permanently trapped within the first 2 stages. We migrate from one sphere to the next, not because we are chasing truth, but because our previous defense mechanism has completely run out of psychological fuel. We treat our lifestyle shifts as massive personal awakenings, but from an analytical standpoint, they are often just a highly sophisticated change of clothes, a new set of masks, designed to keep our core consciousness comfortably sedated, safe from the terrifying work of establishing a unique, sovereign identity with 0 external safety nets. The aesthetic sphere, the addiction to the next stimulus. The first, most primitive territory of human development is the aesthetic sphere. In our contemporary American culture, this is the absolute playground of the consumerist matrix. The aesthetic individual is not necessarily a shallow, uneducated brute. They can be highly sophisticated, deeply artistic, intellectually brilliant, and obsessively well curated. The defining characteristic of the aesthetic psychology is not what it consumes, but how it relates to time, choice, and immediate internal emotional states. The aesthetic mind treats life exactly like a digital streaming playlist. It operates on a single, absolute psychological mandate: maximize immediate stimulation, cultivate interesting moods, and avoid the horror of boredom at all absolute costs. The aesthetic person views themselves as an observer of their own emotional states. They look at a relationship, a career path, a creative hobby, or an intellectual philosophy through a single, hyper-reactive lens. Is this interesting? Does this give me a sudden spark of emotional intensity? Does this lift my mood right now? To understand the core pathology of this stage, we must analyze its relationship with the concept of commitment. To the aesthetic psychology, a long-term commitment is an absolute cognitive prison. If they commit to a single career path, a single geographic location, or a single relationship partner, they are forced to close the door on all other infinite possibilities. They are forced to step onto the cliff of their freedom and take responsibility for a specific trajectory. To avoid that dizziness, the aesthetic person refuses to choose. They stay in a state of permanent, fluid floating. They swipe through partners like products, bounce from one trendy side hustle to the next, change their personal style every 6 months, and submerge their awareness in an endless stream of immediate dopaminergic hits. But modern behavioral science has exposed the absolute baseline failure of this design through the law of hedonic adaptation and dopaminergic desensitization. The aesthetic lifestyle is built on an unsustainable mathematical formula. You need a constant, accelerating supply of novel, high-intensity external stimuli just to maintain a baseline level of internal satisfaction. Eventually, the treadmill runs out of speed. The novel relationship turns into an ordinary routine. The exciting new city becomes just another collection of streets. The high-end consumer purchase loses its glittering, dopaminergic smokescreen within a matter of days. The aesthetic individual hits a hard, unyielding psychological wall that Kierkegaard identifies as the ultimate, inescapable destination of pure hedonism, absolute, crushing boredom, langueur, and systemic melancholia. The noise stops, the screen fades to black, and the underlying silence of their own empty, unanchored identity moves in to paralyze their chest. They realize that they have spent their decades chasing ghosts, consuming shadows, and turning their consciousness into a chaotic, fragmented collection of passing moods, completely hollowed out by their own inability to choose anything real. The ethical sphere, the fortress of the respectable persona. When the aesthetic lifestyle inevitably collapses into absolute burnout and existential nausea, when the individual realizes that swiping through cheap dopamine hits can no longer mask the freezing dread in their heart, their ego undergoes a massive defensive transformation. They do not look inward and face the cliff. Instead, they violently leap across the border into the second territory of human evasion, the ethical sphere. In our modern social arena, this transition is celebrated as a magnificent, mature awakening. The individual looks at their past aesthetic fragmentation and says, "I am done with the games. I am done with the floating. I am going to grow up, take responsibility, and build a real life." They step onto the floor of compliance. They become the model corporate worker who clocks in early and checks every single metric on the dashboard. They become the dedicated family man or woman who buys the house with the 30-year mortgage in a respectable zip code. They adopt the rigid moral frameworks, the political dogmas, and the social expectations of their specific cultural tribe with absolute, unyielding seriousness. The ethical individual replaces the aesthetic question of, "Is it interesting?" with the moral question of, "Is it my duty?" They find an immense, intoxicating sense of psychological relief in the concepts of stability, law, structure, and universal rules. They are no longer floating in a chaotic void of endless possibilities. They have signed their name to a clearly defined, prepackaged script provided by their society. They know exactly who they are supposed to be at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, how they are supposed to dress, what they are supposed to care about, and how they are supposed to vote. But from an analytical psychological standpoint, the ethical sphere is often just a more advanced, highly sophisticated masquerade, the absolute fortress of the social persona. Kierkegaard realized that the ethical person has not actually chosen their true self. They have simply allowed the collective herd to choose for them. They have traded the aesthetic addiction to pleasure for an ethical addiction to respectability, validation, and social safety. The trap of the ethical mind is its profound self-righteousness and institutional conditioning. By hiding behind the universal laws of the group, the individual successfully avoids the terrifying, personalized responsibility of their own free will. If they make a mistake, if their life feels empty, or if their soul is suffocating, they can always point to the script and say, "But I did everything right. I followed the rules. I paid my taxes. I satisfied the metrics. I kept the audience happy." They use their external productivity and moral perfection as a giant defensive smokescreen to drown out the quiet, screaming voice of their own unique identity. They turn themselves into high-yield social assets, running on a hamster wheel of structural compliance, completely blind to the fact that they have committed absolute psychological suicide to buy an illusion of safety from a tribe that doesn't even know their true name. The psychological breakdown of the ethical prison. The tragic reality of the ethical sphere is that it carries its own internal, slow-burning fuse of psychological destruction. No matter how perfectly you follow the corporate script, no matter how clean your moral image looks in the social mirror, you cannot permanently squeeze the boundless, infinite architecture of a human consciousness into a flat box of societal rules without triggering a severe internal revolt. Over time, the ethical individual begins to experience a profound, unexplainable state of existential fatigue. They wake up in their pristine, expensive house, look at their perfect calendar, look at their respectable relationships, and feel a deep, burning wave of absolute meaninglessness slice through their chest. They realize that they are living a life that belongs entirely to an institution, a parent, a company, or a cultural dogma. They are executing a performance that was written by dead men, and their actual, unique, unoptimized soul is sitting in a dark cell in the basement of their mind, starving to death from a total lack of authentic oxygen. Furthermore, the ethical mind eventually hits a hard boundary that Kierkegaard calls the realization of universal guilt and limitation. The ethical sphere operates on the assumption that if you just try hard enough, if you just execute your duty with perfect discipline, you can achieve complete moral and psychological harmony. But the deeper you analyze your own motivations, the more you discover that your pristine moral actions are completely infected with hidden layers of ego, pride, selfishness, and self-deception. You realize that you cannot think or follow your way into absolute purity through a system of external rules. The structure of compliance collapses under the weight of its own hypocrisy. The individual realizes that the universal script cannot save them from their localized personal hell. They are caught in a terrifying psychological trap. They can no longer return to the shallow, chaotic playground of the aesthetic lifestyle because they know too much. But they can no longer stay inside the rigid, suffocating prison of the ethical sphere without going completely insane. They are brought to a point of absolute, unconditional existential bankruptcy. The defensive masks have all run out of fuel. The drawbridges of the fortresses have been shattered, and they are forced to stand completely alone, shivering on the edge of the cliff, facing the ultimate choice of their existence. The religious sphere, the leap into subjective sovereignty. It is at this exact point of absolute structural collapse that Kierkegaard introduces the final, most radical territory of human consciousness. The religious sphere, or what existential psychology defines as the state of absolute subjective sovereignty. To understand this stage, we must completely strip the word religious of its traditional, institutional meaning. Kierkegaard was not telling you to go back to a church, submit your mind to a priesthood, or follow a set of ancient dogmas. In fact, he spent the final years of his life launching a violent, public war against the state church of Denmark, declaring that institutionalized religion was nothing but a cheap, corrupt extension of the ethical herd, a machine designed to keep people comfortably asleep. The religious sphere is the absolute breakdown of the universal script. It is the territory where the individual realizes that truth is not an objective metric to be found in a book, a rule, a corporate portal, or a collective consensus. Truth is entirely subjective. It is the raw, intimate alignment of your individual consciousness with its own internal depth. In the religious sphere, you stop begging the external screen of reality to give you a set of rules or a guarantee of success. You look at your personal hell, the failure, the isolation, the crisis, and you realize that there is no universal system that can choose your path for you. You must step out of the herd completely. You must look into the bottomless unknown with zero safety nets, accept the absolute absurdity of your existence, and execute what Kierkegaard famously named the leap of faith. The The leap of faith is not an act of intellectual blindness. It is the absolute peak of heroic psychological maturity. It is the moment where you say to the universe, I am standing on the edge of the cliff. I have no objective certainty. I have no data that guarantees my victory. My friends will look at me and think I am completely crazy, but I am going to commit to my path, choose my values, and take absolute, radical responsibility for the outcome anyway, simply because I refuse to live like a dead, performative slave for another second. By executing the leap, you permanently relocate your locus of control entirely inward. You transition from a hyper-reactive puppet who is constantly balancing between aesthetic pleasure and ethical compliance into an absolute sovereign of your own mind. You stop checking the social mirror to see if your life looks correct, and you anchor your identity entirely in the deep, quiet, untouchable sanctuary of your own subjective commitment. You accept the chaos. You welcome the risk. You step out onto the open air of the unknown, and you discover the invincible, beautiful freedom of a soul that has finally chosen to be real. Reprogramming the sovereign soul. The philosophy of Søren Kierkegaard's developmental spheres is an aggressive, tactical field intervention directed straight at the heart of your daily self-deception. He forces you to look right through the magnificent stories you tell yourself about your lifestyle, your career goals, and your moral respectability, and demands that you identify your true starting position on the map. It is time to stop hiding inside the masquerade of self-escape and claim your true nature as an awake individual. To use this existential architecture to reprogram your soul today, you must begin by launching a relentless, daily audit of your aesthetic habits. Stop acting like a high-end dopamine addict who treats their life like a curated streaming playlist. Look closely at your compulsive need for novel stimuli, digital distractions, and immediate lifestyle upgrades, and recognize them for what they truly are: defensive smokescreens designed to help you run from the underlying silence of your own emptiness. Pull the emergency brake on your consumption, drop the floating, and force your mind to sit perfectly still in the quiet tower of the present moment. Secondly, execute an immediate demolition of your ethical prison. Stop outsourcing your identity to a corporate script, a parental expectation, or an ideological tribe. Look at the respectable masks you wear to secure validation and safety from the herd, and have the immense honesty to acknowledge the slow-burning suffocation taking place inside your chest. Fire the internal social attorney who is constantly trying to make your life look perfect in the social mirror. Step out of the arena of structural compliance and accept that your true worth can never be measured by a metric. Finally, cultivate the immense psychological stamina required to execute your own localized leap of faith. Stop waiting for an absolute, risk-free guarantee from the universe before you make your next major move. Recognize that objective certainty is a dynamic mirage designed to keep you paralyzed in a state of permanent cowardice. Look straight into the bottomless unknown of your worst fears: the fear of failure, the fear of being wrong, and the fear of standing completely alone. Take a deep breath and leap headfirst into your authentic trajectory. Claim the absolute, unchallengeable sovereignty of your subjective truth. Break the matrix of collective groupthink. Stand firm on the edge of your own cliff and discover the beautiful, invincible freedom of a soul that has finally earned the right to live real. We live in a culture that diagnoses our internal emptiness completely wrong. When a modern professional falls into a state of chronic, grey exhaustion when they wake up in the morning and feel an unexplainable weight crushing their spirit, or look at their highly successful life and feel absolutely nothing, our society immediately treats the condition as an external tactical error. The self-help industry rushes in to prescribe a series of superficial adjustments. Optimize your workflow, restructure your daily metrics, fix your sleep architecture, or download a mindfulness app. We talk as if our deep, existential numbness is simply a minor operations problem, a temporary breakdown in our performance efficiency that can be scrubbed clean with the right corporate wellness routine. We look at the surface screen of reality and believe that if a person is making money, accumulating assets, maintaining a highly respectable relationship status, and smiling for their digital audience, they must be psychologically whole. We treat visible success as the absolute antidote to internal suffering. But nearly 2 centuries ago, Søren Kierkegaard wrote a clinical psychological autopsy that completely shatters this narcissistic illusion. In his dark, profound masterpiece, the sickness unto death. He diagnosed a silent, terminal tumor of the human psyche that he named despair, fortvivelse. Kierkegaard discovered that despair is not a situational bad mood, a passing depression, or a chemical glitch in your hardware. Despair is the absolute failure of the human self to align with its true nature. It is a chronic sickness of untruth. The most terrifying insight of Kierkegaard's clinical autopsy is that despair does not look like a weeping patient locked in a dark room. The deadliest form of despair walks through the world wearing tailored suits, holding elite corporate titles, and receiving standing ovations from the herd. He exposes the concept of the secret bleeding of the successful ego, a psychological phenomenon where a person can be perfectly well adjusted to a sick society, completely optimized for external production, while their true authentic core is actively rotting to death in total, suffocating silence. The diagnostics of despair, the split self. To master Kierkegaard's clinical anatomy of the broken mind, we must dissect the precise definition of despair he presents in The Sickness Unto Death. He does not look at the self as a static, solid object. He defines the human self as a dynamic, highly volatile relation, a delicate psychological tension suspended between the finite and the infinite, the temporal and the eternal. Despair occurs the exact millisecond this tension fractures, splitting your consciousness into two distinct, pathological forms of self-evasion. The first major pathology is what Kierkegaard calls the despair of weakness, the state of desperately refusing to be oneself. In modern clinical terms, this is the absolute surrender to conformity, repression, and pure societal castration. The individual looks at the terrifying cliff of their own unique potential, experiences a violent surge of existential anxiety, and decides to flee from their freedom entirely. They choose to stop existing as an independent individual. They completely submerge their identity into the safe, warm, and thoughtless camouflage of the herd. They become exactly what the company wants, exactly what their parents expected, and exactly what their cultural tribe dictates. They operate like a highly efficient, perfectly predictable biological machine, satisfying every single external metric on the dashboard. They think they are safe, but their ego has actually committed absolute psychological suicide to buy an illusion of security from a crowd that doesn't even know their true name. The second major pathology is the dark flip side of the coin, what Kierkegaard calls the despair of defiance, the state of desperately trying to be someone else, or trying to construct a self entirely on one's own arrogant terms. In contemporary behavioral science, this is the absolute definition of defensive narcissism and grandiosity. The individual looks at their internal fractures, their deep human vulnerability, and their original childhood wounds, and instead of accepting them with radical humility, their ego builds a magnificent, hyper-armored persona of absolute self-sufficiency. They try to play God. They attempt to engineer a flawless, optimized simulation of perfection, wealth, and intellectual mastery, using their external achievements as a giant, defensive fortress to hide the shivering, terrified child locked in the basement of their mind. They are aggressively performing an idealized character for the social mirror, completely trapped in a state of permanent performance anxiety, because they know that if the audience ever sees the unedited, fragile truth underneath the mask, their entire universe will collapse into dust. The secret bleeding of the successful ego. The absolute peak of Kierkegaard's psychological horror is his realization that the vast majority of people who are trapped in terminal despair are completely unaware of their own condition. The system is engineered to reward your self-betrayal. If you successfully suppress your unique individual voice to become a compliant corporate asset, the market awards you with money, respectability, and social status. The herd looks at your pristine external screen and declares you to be a magnificent winner. Kierkegaard names this state the despair that is unconscious of being despair. It is the most dangerous, malignant pathology in human psychology because it carries zero surface symptoms. The patient is not crying. They are thriving by every metric of the marketplace. He writes in The Sickness Unto Death, there is a state of despair which is completely unconscious of itself. A man lives on in a state of tranquil satisfaction, completely optimized for the world, married, raising children, admired by his peers, making a fortune, and executing his duties with absolute perfection. He is universally regarded as a model of health and success. Yet, his soul is completely dead. He has traded his absolute individual eternity for a collection of trivialities, completely blind to the fact that he has lost himself in the crowd, living like a walking corpse whose inner clock has already stopped ticking. Think about the raw, visceral weight of this diagnosis in our modern American landscape. This is the exact profile of the mid-career executive who has achieved everything on their checklist. They have the title, the net worth, the beautiful house, and the envy of their social circle. They have optimized their life down to a single percentage point. Yet, when the noise of their busy calendar stops for a single second, when they find themselves sitting alone in their luxury car at a red light at midnight, looking out at the rain, a sudden, freezing wave of absolute nothingness cuts through their chest like a razor blade. They look at their life and realize that they are an absolute stranger to themselves. The person sitting in the driver's seat is not an authentic human soul. It is a highly polished corporate product that was custom built to keep the audience happy. They have sacrificed their irreplaceable life energy, their true creative sparks, and their baseline emotional honesty to buy a seat at a table that means absolutely nothing to their actual consciousness. They are bleeding out internally from a total lack of meaning, but because their wounds are covered in gold, diamonds, and corporate metrics, they cannot even admit to their own mind that they are dying in the dark. The psychology of mass repression, the castrated collective. To understand why this invisible rot is so pervasive, we must look at how our contemporary hyper-connected society actively industrializes mass repression. In modern behavioral and transpersonal psychology, this is known as institutionalized depersonalization. The corporate and social matrix cannot tolerate your raw, unpolished, and unoptimized individuality. A unique, awake, and completely honest human soul is a source of unpredictable friction that disrupts the efficiency of the assembly line. The system hooks your nervous system early by exploiting your deep evolutionary fear of isolation. It sets up an absolute, unyielding binary choice. Submit to the collective persona of the herd and receive immediate material comfort, safety, and digital validation, or step onto the cliff of your individual freedom and face the absolute terror of standing completely alone, misunderstood by your peers, and rejected by the marketplace of prestige. The vast majority of us look at that cliff, clench our fists in panic, and eagerly trade our cognitive sovereignty for the golden chains of compliance. We adopt the pre-packaged political slogans, submerge our awareness in the trendy digital panics of our tribe, and optimize our behavior to match the shifting metrics of the social mirror. We turn our minds into a permanent psychological border patrol, aggressively censoring our true opinions, suppressing our true shadow, and suffocating our authentic bluebird before it can make a single sound that might disturb the audience. Kierkegaard notes that this mass repression creates a society that is completely flat, hollowed out, and spiritually castrated. We become a collective of highly productive dead ghosts who are running on a hamster wheel of debt and consumption to numb the underlying scream of our own self-betrayal. We use our external busyness, our endless metrics, and our lifestyle toys as a giant, defensive smokescreen to avoid facing the bottomless vacuum inside our chests. We have successfully engineered a world where a human being can win every single game in the material universe, while standing face to face with a dead, aborted soul inside their own chest. Reprogramming the integrated citadel. The philosophy of Søren Kierkegaard's autopsy of despair is a direct, merciless execution of your daily self-deception. He forces you to step off the arena floor, look past the glittering smokescreen of your external achievements, your bank balance, and your social prestige, and ask yourself the terrifying, liberating question: is the self that is currently running my life my true, authentic, and integrated soul, or is it just a highly polished corporate mask that I built to escape the dizziness of my freedom? To use this clinical diagnosis to reprogram your soul today, you must begin by initiating an immediate, total destruction of your moral and professional vanity. Stop using your visible success, your optimized routines, and the applause of the crowd to gaslight your own internal suffering. If you feel empty, acknowledge that you are empty. If your career cage is suffocating your spirit, stop telling yourself that it's just a tactical logistics problem. Have the immense, heroic stamina to look directly into the mirror of your consciousness and admit the open, bleeding reality of your self-betrayal. Secondly, You must systematically dismantle your defensive persona. Stop trying to play God by engineering a flawless, hyper-armored simulation of perfection to hide your internal wounds. Fire the internal corporate marketing director who is constantly trying to filter your life for the social mirror. Drop the grandiosity. Accept your raw human vulnerability with radical humility and step out of the arena of competitive posturing. Allow your unoptimized, unedited, and regular reality to exist without the constant, suffocating censorship of your defensive narcissism. Finally, execute a radical, sovereign relocation of your locus of control. Pull your heart's identity completely out of the marketplace of collective consensus and structural compliance. Stop begging the blind locusts of your social arena to tell you who you are supposed to be, what you are supposed to want, and how you are supposed to live. Relocate your drawbridge inward. Stand firm in the deep, quiet tower of your own subjective truth, and take absolute, radical responsibility for the alignment of your soul. Break the matrix of institutional conditioning. Step onto the ledge of your own cliff. Look straight into the bottomless unknown of your worst fears, and discover the beautiful, invincible freedom of a human being who has finally chosen to smash the simulation and live real.